You can win at RPGs, but if you want to, you have to understand what they are and how they work. I want to take you all the way back to the very beginning. I want to strip away all of the dross. I want to pare these games down to the bare minimum. And in order to do that, first I want to go back in time a little bit. I want to talk about the parent of RPGs, and that's the war game. And there's an awful lot of war games out there, and there's an awful lot of discussions about what makes a war game, and we're not here to litigate that. I'm not going to argue about where those exact boundaries lie. What I will point out is that there is a useful guide that you can use. Yes, the edges are a little fuzzy. Yes, you can get into some Ship of Theseus issues, but by and large, war games they follow the same process. I have some pieces that occupy real estate, and you have pieces that occupy real estate, and we are going to take turns activating our pieces to either secure more real estate or to eliminate your pieces, which, when your pieces are gone, they don't secure any more real estate. So if I can eliminate all of yours and I still have some, then I've got all the real estate. So the core gameplay loop of war games is that I do an activation, try to seize territory, try to limit how much territory you control, and then you do the same. And that's true for all games. That's even true of a game as abstract as chess. The more territory generally, the more pieces I have, the more I control of the board, the more likely I am to control the one piece of geography that really matters, the ground that my opponent's king stands on. This is true for games like Risk. It's really obvious. Whoever controls the most territories is the winner. The actual objective of the game is to control a certain number of territories. For a miniature war game, even for something like one-page rules, the core game that comes with the free one page is that you place D3 plus 2 objective markers down, and whoever can secure the most objective markers, the most real estate, at the end of 4 turns wins the game. There are subcategories where maybe I secure victory points by killing more of your guys. But again, that's just another way of securing real estate. Now, the interesting thing, and I think one of the reasons that this hobby has been so persistent, is that there are an awful lot of ways that you can engage with that core loop. I activate, you activate. Now, in some games, the most popular and the financially most successful, Warhammer 40K, I move and I shoot. We do the 4 M's. I move, I do missiles, I do melee, I do morale with everything I got. And then you do it with everything you've got. In some other games, one-page rules, I will do everything with one of my units. They'll move, shoot, fight. And then you do that with one of your units. Core gameplay loop. We're taking turns activating. Some games use a chip draw method, like the Warlord games, bolt action. We have one chip for each of our units, and we just take turns drawing. So I might get 3 activations in a row, but you're going to get 3 activations in a row. Assuming we have the same number of chips in the bag, we're going to get the same number of activations. There's a lot of different ways to do this. You can probably think of a dozen more, but that's really the core mechanic. This gave birth to a different understanding of war games called role-playing games. And in role-playing games, you have a narrative structure. But whereas a neutral third-party referee is not required for war games, it is required for what we traditionally think of role-playing games. In a traditional role-playing game, the gameplay loop looks a little something like this. Well, instead of geography, the geography of the table matters. There's one game master who sits on one side of a screen or on one side of the table, and then all of the rest of the players sit on the other side. And the players have to overcome arbitrary obstacles designed by the game master. The core gameplay loop is the game master describes the scene, and then the players, working together for the most part, have to guess what they need to do to get to the next scene. You have to cross the underground canyon. Well, do we have enough rope? We set a challenge. The players ask questions. The players look for solutions. And those solutions may be punching the obstacle in the face until it falls over. Sometimes you let dice decide whether the player's actions are successful. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you just compare numbers. There is a highly contentious issue that gets discussed at length as to whether or not one of the players at the table, the one sitting behind the game master's screen, is allowed to ignore the dice because he's playing the other side's opposition forces. All of the players are on one side, the game master is on the other, and the game master creates the world, runs the rules of the world, and again, there's some debate. There are a lot of different ways to engage this loop. How much leeway does the game master have to ignore the previously agreed upon set of rules? Some people think he should have absolute and total ability to ignore the rules at whim, at will, and without notifying the players beforehand. Other people say he doesn't have that right at all. If you've agreed to play a set of rules, play that set of rules. He's bound by the same rules as everyone else at the table. Again, I'm not here to litigate that because it doesn't really matter. It doesn't change the core loop. One guy runs an opposition force. He creates a fog of war. The rest of the players working together try to overcome the obstacles presented to them so they can get to the next, they get a little bit of a reward, they can get to the next set of obstacles. That's the core gameplay loop. Notice the difference. In a war game, you've got two oppositional sides, two players in opposition, trying to secure the same real estate. In a role-playing game, the core gameplay loop is most of the players on one side trying to overcome the obstacles, placing their trust into the hands of the player on the other side, whom we call the game master. Those are the two core gameplay loops. And when you strip everything away, that's really what's foundational. Once again, I'll hammer this home because I know some of you are talking about this. You don't have to be on the same side of all the players don't have to be on the same side. Yes, you're right. There are exceptions to the rule. The edges of these definitions are fuzzy. You have games like Paranoia, where the stated mission provided by the game master, who still runs all the opposition forces, by the way, is kind of irrelevant. It's just there to give you something to pretend to do while you're busy trying to backstab the rest of the players at the table. It's not an absolute requirement that the players are all on the same side, but it is the generally agreed upon approach to the games, and the game becomes a lot more complicated and difficult to run and to engage in if the players are ostensibly supposed to be on the same side, but they engage in the sort of backstabbing behavior that you see in games of Paranoia. More than anything else, I think this is the big difference between war games and role-playing games. It's that core gameplay loop is so different. And it's that ability to engage in player versus player, almost an obligation in war games, to engage in player versus player gamesmanship, that you have the conflict that drives war games. But I want to go back to those for a second because there is another gameplay loop that is closely associated with war games. This is best exemplified in the game Diplomacy. In the game Diplomacy, the real estate, the shoving armies and navies around a map, is a byproduct of the real gameplay loop, which is a negotiation between and among players. In order to secure your objectives, you need the assistance of other players. The rules as written are, you have 15 minutes to negotiate. Then you write down orders, and then everybody adjudicates those orders. I think it's one player adjudicates them on a rotating basis. And it looks like a war game because you are still faced with the objective of trying to secure real estate using a limited number of tokens or pawns. So now we're into one of those gray areas. But it's interesting that that game has been played for so long because the core gameplay loop is a psychological one where you make promises to people. The strategies involved with Diplomacy can be mastered in a single game. The intricacies of understanding how to gain someone's trust, how to judge whether they're lying, how to know when you're about to be backstabbed, how to pick your moment to betray an ally to secure a big win, Those things are very interesting, and that's the real challenge of a game like Diplomacy. But it's interesting, and this is where we start thinking about role-playing games in a very different way. If you take that base layer of a war game and you make that a secondary component of a diplomatic game, you have a wildly successful and very popular game that has been around for decades. It precedes role-playing games. Although, if you squint right, it can be a role-playing game. There are examples of people dressing up as the leaders of the various nations of diplomacy. The French king donning a crown, the British king donning a crown, the French player speaking with a bad French accent or British accent, respectively. The Tsar of Russia speaking with a bad Russian accent and deciding where he will go, making perhaps suboptimal tactical choices because he prefers to play the role of a Tsar of Russia, and which Tsar he picks might indicate who he is most likely to ally with or betray. Right? So the point is that you've got this other kind of appendix of war games, and I don't mean in the organ sense of it doesn't really matter, but really it's kind of this little odd, quirky thing that kind of is a war game, but the war game is secondary. Now, is there a way to do that with role-playing games? Is there that same kind of slightly different approach to role-playing games that will allow for the same kind of play as diplomacy? And it turns out there is. And it turns out that style of game precedes role-playing games themselves. It is the connective tissue, the missing link between war games and role-playing games. It's called a Bronstein, for lack of a better term. A man named David Wesley was a miniature wargamer, and he came up with this style of role-playing game. Remember, this is before the term had been coined yet, in which you had a faction similar to the way you do in diplomacy. And you had resources. Now, instead of armies and navies on a map of Europe, your resources might be an order of battle. If you run a Bronstein, as he did in a banana republic in the days before a coup, your faction might be the dock workers, the unionized dock workers, and you have to decide whether to back the current ruling junta, the military, or will you back the socialist student union. You've got a bunch of dock workers who are really tough thugs. That's a resource that you have, and you have to go to the army and negotiate. You go to the student union. You go to the CIA. The Americans have no forces on the ground, but what they do have is a whole lot of money to spread around, and they can buy a lot of support from a lot of people. You have to go talk to the guy that runs the TV news station, because right now the TV news station has armed guards. Some of the resources of the army general are at the TV station, and if you can beat them up and kick them out, then you will control the TV station, and that player will be grateful to you, and he will use the TV station for your aim. You are engaged in a role-playing game, but the role-playing game is a bit of a hybrid in the same way diplomacy is, because you're also engaged in you don't just control the docks anymore, you now also control the TV station, which gives you power-ups. You are engaged in almost a war game. You are trying to control geography. Now, it may not be physical geography. It may be intellectual geography. It may be moral geography. But you are trying to secure the resources that you need in order to improve your situation with respect to the other players. This is a very powerful way of playing games, and it is a gameplay loop that breaks from RPGs because it incorporates a war game style understanding of how games work. It's okay. I am in direct opposition to everyone at the table because our goals are very different. But I need the support of some of them so that I can achieve my goals. And likewise, they all need my support to achieve their goals. We have to do a little bit of politicking. We have to use our war game resources in the same way we do diplomacy, but we have to engage in a lot of role-playing in order to get there. The gameplay loop of a Bronstein isn't as easy to define, in part because our understanding and our practice is still in its infancy. The original Bronstein has been run a number of times at various conventions. Banania has been run at various times at different conventions. There have been cowboy Bronsteins. Brownstone, Texas was the original, which happened hot on the heels of the wildly successful first. There was a Bronstein, a medieval one, called Blackmore, that eventually midwifed role-playing games themselves into being. But these are largely static styles of game. These have always been run in the same way, and without serious study and serious experimentation and serious thought and discussion about how to run a Bronstein, it's very hard for us here, as we begin the initial exploration of this new gameplay loop, to even define what it is. This idea of role-playing games as a little bit of information from the game master, we ask for clarity, we ask probing questions to try to resolve the mysteries. That core loop hasn't been discussed at length except within the last 10, 20 years, thanks to the guys in the OSR who got that far and then stopped. But now we're looking at Bronsteins, and now we're looking at this idea of how do we manage the core gameplay loop? And it turns out there kind of is one, and that's you have a setup, you have a situation or a scenario that takes place within a limited time period. It could be a season. It's the summer. It's time for the barons to go to war. Or it's the fall. The harvest is in. Now, before the heavy snows set in, we've got 6 weeks in order to beat each other up and figure out who is going to take whose lands, who is going to take whose money, who is going to become the next king. We've got 6 weeks to resolve that, which means what we're going to do is we are going to defer to diplomacy. And the way most Bronsteins work, and there are some options here. We're going to talk about one of the best ways to learn about these here in a moment. But one of the ways to run a Bronstein is to say, look, we're going to do 6 turns. You guys go talk. And if we're talking on the internet, maybe we have a week to make our discussions. But at the end of that week, we have to try to, everybody writes down their orders, similar to what you see in diplomacy. But instead of ordering armies from one space to another, sky's the limit. You have a role-playing mindset of, if I am running the CIA agent in Banania, I can do whatever I want. I can try to steal a helicopter. The sky is the limit. If I am the dock workers, I can break into the armory, steal uniforms, go stage a massacre at the student union, and then back off and blame the army for the massacre of the students so that the farm workers will help us. Or so that the Banania Fruit Company will call on the American CIA agent to summon the American military to serve as peacekeepers, by which I mean appointing the head of the dock workers as the new junta leader. Sky's the limit. You can do what you want. But you have to turn those orders in to the game master. And the game master takes those and he has to adjudicate them. He is a neutral referee, similar to the way he was in a miniature war game. But in this case, he takes everybody's orders and he looks for the intersections. Where is the conflict going to occur? And then he has to adjudicate those conflicts, determine who the winner is, or tell the 2 players, you guys are engaged in a brawl. You thought it was going to happen in one district, but it turns out it happens in another. Sunday morning at the cathedral, your 2 forces meet. You thought it was going to happen later that afternoon, but it happens earlier because of the intersection of those demands. The game master will adjudicate the orders in the way that makes the game most interesting. He operates very much as a hybrid. He is a neutral party. I don't care which of these players wins, as was the case in war games. But, as is the case in role-playing games, he has the narrative authority to interpret those orders in a way that maximizes the enjoyment of the experience. And generally that will mean driving towards definitive confrontations that will provide for definitive answers to who gets what they want and who gets left behind. You can do this on a daily basis, a weekly basis, but that's the general gameplay loop. We spend some time talking, then we turn in our orders, then the neutral referee adjudicates those orders. The situation has changed. We have to spend more time talking now that we've processed those results for ourselves. Someone betrayed us. We need to find more allies. Can we find someone that already hated the guy that betrayed us? Who else has he betrayed? We're going to rope them in and bring them to them. If you want to read more about this, the best place to go to is a little supplement called Browser. Here it is, the best supplement for role-playing games or war games or something in between ever made, because it will offer you written advice on different ways to apply these games, these Bronsteins. And because they are an adjunct to both war games, the original Bronstein was rumored to be a prelude to a war game that never happened. You can also use these as a means of conflict resolution for your role-playing game. Anytime you have multiple factions who are in conflict operating under fog of war within a limited time and geography, you can drop this into your own campaign. Set your players aside. If you're running through a standard narrative campaign, A to B to C, set the party aside. Gather your players and say, look, you're the Dark Lord, you're the Orc Lord, you're the head of the Church of Light, you're the head of the Knightly Order, you're the head of the Druid's Grove. You all want to get the MacGuffin, go to town. And Browser can help you do that. It presents an island far to the north in your campaign world where just such a thing has happened. There is a MacGuffin stone. A meteorite has fallen from the sky, and it is magic. And everybody wants a piece, but the only guy that is going to wind up with it is the one that can play the game and play the other players the best. Maybe multiple players can agree to split it. Maybe some players want something else. I don't really need that stone. I need something else on this island. I want territory on the island, and I'll help you get the stone if you give me more territory. I just want all of those people dead. If you help me kill all those people along the way, then we can work together. I'll give you the MacGuffin stone. This is available at DriveThruRPG today for free. It's also available at cost for print. You go print yourself a copy, buy a copy off of Amazon. They'll print it off for you at their cost. None of the dozen plus authors who contributed factions to this island will make any money from it. And if you think this is all just a bunch of highfalutin intellectual hogwash and you don't care about it, you should still get a copy of it, because it includes a dozen interesting factions that you can rip from the module and plug directly into your campaign almost without thinking. But I highly recommend you at least read the couple of first half dozen pages for advice on Bronsteins, because even if you don't run a full-blown Bronstein, it's a great way to add interest to your hobby. And because these kinds of games are so unexplored, they are fertile ground for you to explore a new style of game that bridges the gap, that provides connective tissue between war games and RPGs. It is the missing link, missing no longer. Get yourself a copy of Browser. Go forth and game like you've never gamed before. It'll make you a better man. Till next time, I'm Mr. Wargaming, and I'm praying for you.